The Detroit Lions are entering one of the most critical stretches of the offseason, and the timing could not be more intense. With the legal tampering period less than 24 hours away, the entire NFL world is about to move at full speed. Lions fans know how quickly this league operates. By the time free agency officially opens on Wednesday at 4 p.m., most of the biggest names are already off the board. That's just the reality of the modern NFL. Deals get discussed early, agreements happen fast, and teams that hesitate often miss out. Right now, the Lions front office is gathering information, evaluating options, and trying to decide exactly what direction they want to take over the next few days. But in the middle of all this preparation, a very interesting conversation has started circulating around the team and among insiders, and it involves a name that many Lions fans remember very well from the 2023 NFL Draft, Jaylen Carter. This is a fascinating situation because if you go back to that draft, a lot of Detroit fans desperately wanted Carter. At the time, he was viewed as one of the most talented defensive players in the entire class, maybe even a potential #1 overall pick before the draft process unfolded. However, questions surrounding off-field issues before the draft caused his stock to slide, and that created a dilemma for teams that prioritize culture and character. The Detroit Lions under Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell have made it very clear how they operate. If there is even a hint of potential locker room disruption, they simply stay away. We've already seen that approach with players who were removed from the roster once issues surfaced. The message from this regime has always been simple: talent matters, but culture matters just as much. That philosophy played a huge role in Detroit's decision during the 2023 draft. Instead of selecting Carter with the 6th overall pick that originally came from the Matthew Stafford trade with the Los Angeles Rams, the Lions traded back and eventually selected Jahmyr Gibbs a few picks later. Meanwhile, Carter ended up going 9th overall to the Philadelphia Eagles. Since then, he has spent 3 seasons in the league and has already experienced major success as part of a dominant Eagles defensive line. Philadelphia even built that line around him and Jordan Davis, 2 massive interior defenders who helped anchor one of the most feared pass rush units in football. At one point, the Eagles recorded 70 sacks in a season, leading the entire league. That kind of production from a defensive front changes everything for a defense. But now things may be shifting in Philadelphia. According to insider discussions, the Eagles recently extended Jordan Davis, and because of that, they now have a major financial decision looming with Jaylen Carter. Carter is eligible for a new deal, and teams around the league have reportedly started making trade calls to Philadelphia to explore the possibility of acquiring him. And that's where things get interesting for Detroit, because if Carter is truly available, the Lions would instantly become one of the most fascinating potential landing spots. Think about the storyline here. The player many fans wanted in 2023, the same player the Lions passed on due to their culture standards, could now theoretically be obtainable through a trade. It would be a full circle moment for the franchise and the fan base. Of course, Carter's career has not been without controversy since entering the league. He was suspended for the opening game of one season after being ejected during a pre-game altercation where he spit on another player. Incidents like that are exactly the type of behavior the Lions usually avoid. At the same time, there's no denying the talent. Through 3 seasons, Carter has recorded sack totals of 6, 4.5, and then a lower total in his 3rd year, giving him 13.5 career sacks as an interior defensive lineman. For a defensive tackle, those numbers are not insignificant. Interior pressure is incredibly valuable in today's NFL, and players who can disrupt the pocket from the middle are always in high demand, but acquiring him would not come cheap. There is a strong belief that the price could include a 1st-round pick, and that's where the debate really begins. Is the talent worth the cost? Does he fit the culture the Lions have built? And most importantly, does adding one player actually push Detroit closer to a Super Bowl? Because the truth is, the Lions roster still has several areas that need improvement. Even though Carter is a difference maker, this team may not be just one player away anymore. So now the conversation shifts to you, the fans. If the Eagles truly listen to trade offers and the Detroit Lions have a chance to make a move, would you want them to pursue Jaylen Carter after everything that has happened since the 2023 draft? Or do you think Brad Holmes should stay committed to the current roster building philosophy and avoid the risk altogether? If the Detroit Lions were to seriously explore a move for Jaylen Carter, the financial side of the equation would immediately become one of the biggest talking points. Because when you start digging into the contract details, that's where this entire situation starts to get very interesting. According to contract information tied to the 2023 first-round draft class, the deadline for fifth-year options is May 1st, and right now, the Philadelphia Eagles have not yet exercised that option on Carter. That creates a very specific window where a trade could realistically happen, and if it does happen, it almost certainly would occur before that deadline, possibly even around the time of the NFL draft. That timing matters a lot, because if the Eagles decide not to extend him immediately, they may prefer to move him and avoid a complicated long-term contract situation. And if another team trades for him before the fifth-year option is officially triggered, they would essentially control how they want to handle the next phase of his contract. Now here's where things start to look a little more complicated from Detroit's perspective. That fifth-year option could cost around $27 million. For any player, that's a massive number, but for a defensive tackle, it's especially significant. Fans immediately start thinking about the salary cap, the extensions coming up for other players, and whether the team can realistically afford that kind of commitment. But if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, there is actually a fascinating timeline that lines up with Detroit's current competitive window. Right now, the Lions are approaching what many people believe is a 2-year window where everything has to come together. The leadership structure of the team reflects that timeline. Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell both have 2 years left on their current contracts. At the same time, the Lions also have a potential exit option with Jared Goff after 2 seasons if they choose to go in another direction. That means the next 2 years are absolutely critical for the franchise. Now think about how Jaylen Carter would fit into that timeline. If Detroit traded for him, they could realistically have him under contract for roughly those same 2 seasons before any major long-term financial decision becomes unavoidable. In other words, his contract timeline would match the team's current championship window almost perfectly. That alone is enough to make the discussion a lot more serious than it might have sounded at first. At the same time, the Lions also have major extension priorities on their own roster. Jahmyr Gibbs is widely expected to receive a massive extension in the future, potentially a record-breaking deal for a running back. Jack Campbell is another player the team could prioritize long-term. And then there are players like Sam Laporta and Brian Branch, whose futures will eventually require major decisions as well. So the front office is constantly balancing 2 things, keeping the core of the roster intact while also finding the extra pieces that could push the team over the top. And that brings us to the biggest football question in this entire discussion. Would Jaylen Carter actually be the player who takes Detroit to the next level? A few years ago, the answer might have felt much simpler. In 2023 and even 2024, many people believed the Lions were just one dominant defensive piece away from reaching the Super Bowl. But the situation has evolved. The roster has changed, the competition around the league has shifted, and the Lions themselves have experienced both growth and setbacks along the way. The reality now is that Detroit likely needs multiple upgrades, not just one superstar addition. There's also another layer to this conversation that involves how the Lions have built their defensive line over the past few years. Brad Holmes has invested significant draft capital into that group. Detroit has drafted multiple defensive tackles and defensive linemen in recent drafts, including high selections and players they even traded up to acquire. When you consider those investments, adding another expensive defensive tackle through a trade would raise serious questions about roster allocation. And yet, talent like Jaylen Carter does not become available very often. Sometimes championship teams make aggressive moves because they recognize that windows in the NFL do not stay open forever. Culture matters, chemistry matters, but elite talent can also change games, especially on the defensive line where pressure in the middle can completely disrupt opposing offenses. So this becomes a philosophical question for the Detroit Lions organization. Do they stay committed to the strict culture-first approach that has guided their roster building so far? Or do they consider bending that philosophy slightly if it means adding one of the most physically dominant interior defenders in football? The asking price would be high, the contract would be complicated, and the debate inside the fan base would probably be massive. But sometimes the most interesting offseason discussions are the ones that force you to rethink everything about how a team is built. So now it comes back to you, Lions fans. If the opportunity actually became real and the Eagles were willing to listen to offers, would you want Brad Holmes to take that swing and bring Jaylen Carter to Detroit even with the risks involved? And if the price truly included a first-round pick, would you still make that move? And the more you think about it, the more complicated this conversation becomes for the Detroit Lions front office, because because this is not just about one player. It's about the entire philosophy that Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell have used to build this team from the ground up. From the moment this regime arrived in Detroit, the message was crystal clear. Talent alone would never be enough. The Lions were going to build a culture first. They were going to prioritize players who fit the locker room, players who bought into the identity of the team, and players who would not become distractions off the field. That approach is exactly why certain players were moved off the roster the moment issues appeared, and it's also why some talented prospects were never seriously considered during the draft process. That philosophy helped reshape the identity of the franchise. The Lions became tougher, more disciplined, and more united than they had been in years. And as a result, the team started winning more games and competing deeper into the postseason than Detroit fans had seen in a long time. But now we arrive at a very different stage of the rebuild, or what many people now call the retool, because the Lions are no longer simply trying to become competitive. They already did that. They already proved they can win games. Now the conversation has shifted to something much bigger, finishing the job and reaching the Super Bowl. And when a team reaches that stage, the decision-making sometimes changes. This is where the Jaylen Carter discussion becomes so fascinating, because when you evaluate him purely as a football player, there is no doubt that he has the ability to disrupt offenses in ways that very few defensive tackles can. Interior pressure is one of the most valuable things a defense can have, and when a defensive tackle consistently collapses the pocket, it makes life much easier for the edge rushers and the linebackers behind him. Over the past few seasons, the Lions have invested heavily in the defensive line, particularly at defensive tackle. Several draft picks and roster resources have gone towards strengthening that group, which shows how important the position is in Brad Holmes' long-term vision for the defense. But even with those investments, the production from the interior defensive line hasn't always been dominant. That's why the idea of adding a player like Carter instantly sparks curiosity among fans. Because if you add a disruptive interior presence to an already improving defense, it can completely change how opposing offenses attack the Lions. Still, the question remains, at what cost? Because trading for a player like Carter would almost certainly require significant draft capital, and if the asking price really is a first-round pick, that's a massive decision for a team that still has several roster areas to strengthen. Remember, the Lions are not operating from a position where one player solves everything. The team still needs depth, still needs development from younger players, and still needs to make smart financial decisions with future extensions coming up for key members of the roster. So the front office would have to weigh two very different risks. The first risk is making the trade. If Detroit gives up premium draft capital and takes on the financial responsibility that comes with Carter's contract situation, they are essentially betting that his talent will outweigh any potential concerns and help push the defense to another level. The second risk is not making the trade, because if Carter stays in Philadelphia or ends up on another contender and he continues developing into one of the league's most dominant defensive tackles, Lions fans might look back at this moment and wonder what could have been. And that's what makes the timing of this conversation so perfect right now. Free agency is about to explode across the NFL. The legal tampering period is around the corner, and within days, the entire league will look completely